One of the biggest mistakes that otherwise well-intentioned and relatively awake people make is to assume that the forthcoming tyrannical cataclysm, the Great Reset, which I and so many other commentators are constantly warning of, cannot possibly happen, because the elites whom we charge with its inception simply wouldn't do that to themselves. That is, the billionaire class depends on the continuation of our legacy economic system and Western cultural hegemony to sustain their great wealth, and, just as its downfall would spell the demise of the working and middle classes, so too would it doom the super rich. For the longest time I believed this very thing, and I kept it at the front of my toolkit, and used it as a soothing balm any time I was confronted with conspiracy theories of this ilk, hastily slathering it on my inflamed normie sensibilities when confronted with inconvenient tidbits of information as I drifted through the endlessly fascinating new world of social media which defined the early days of the post-GFC internet. But gradually certain tidbits began connecting, patterns began emerging, rabbit holes converged and opened into dimly lit yet broad and even highways, and after some years the tidbits had become coalescing into facts, often undeniable facts, and these led me further into the labyrinth where I eventually began to uncover larger truths. There are times I wish I could unsee these truths, but short of lobotomy or drug-induced stupor, there is no way back into the matrix. So it is the humble and usually thankless lot of we who have seen to push on, ever forward into the murky recesses and follow that road wherever it leads. Others, however, even those on our team who oppose wokeness, globalism and sustainability, still refuse to take that final step into the darkness and instead cling doggedly to their old ideas, comforting themselves with the notion that, in fact, we are all in this together, as the elites are so wont to assure us at any given opportunity. And the system that nourishes us also nourishes them, and as such, while things may be going in a disagreeable direction, the Great Reset is too fantastical to give credence. The solution lies at the ballot box, and our old two-party system will come right in the end. That enough strongly worded letters to the editor will end the woke madness, and everything will eventually be all right. Far too many on our side still fall into this camp, 1 foot in the rabbit hole and 1 foot out. Head and torso outside of Plato's cave, but legs still dangling inside. And these folk, however well-intentioned, act as unwitting gatekeepers, much like the so-called conservative arms of the corporate media, employing limited hangouts to show that they're hip to the emerging zeitgeist, but ultimately shrinking from the curliest issues. Indeed, one of my readers contacted me recently saying, "I see a lot of detail emerging that links the funding for all the pro-Palestine protests and general Jew bashing to Soros, Pritzker and similar actors. My husband says he cannot see why they would be underwriting the destabilisation of the US and the West, as these economies rely on the supply and purchase of goods on which these people depend for their fortunes." To understand why this coping mechanism is fallacious, one must understand the true nature of our elites and the enterprise in which they are engaged. And, much as few people enjoy a history lecture, to understand this, we must go back about 100 years to the emergence of the Rockefeller dynasty. What follows is largely informed by the stellar work of Ivor Cummins and his documentary discussions with Dr. Jacob Nordengard, whose book, Rockefeller, Controlling the Game, linked in the description, should be required reading for anyone wishing to understand how the world really works. However, The 2-hour discussion, linked in the description, with Cummins, is a meaty synopsis and will serve as great auxiliary viewing to this video. I'm going to cover this long and intriguing history in as few words as possible, but everything that follows about the Rockefellers and their many collaborators is historical fact, not conspiracy theory, and thoroughly referenced in Dr. Nordengaard's book. By the time John D. Rockefeller had become the world's first billionaire through his monopoly Standard Oil, he was getting a lot of bad press. Unlike today, the media in his time were not bought and paid for by the conglomerate of big business interests and NGOs that he himself would spawn. And articles and cartoons were appearing in major papers, raising alarm bells about his undue influence on the White House and Congress. Rockefeller was also widely blamed by an outraged public for the Ludlow massacre, in which private guards from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, of which he was part owner, joined with National Guardsmen in attacking 1,200 striking coal miners, killing 21 people, including wives and children. To combat this bad publicity, he did exactly what Bill Gates did 85 years later, when he was given a humiliating slapdown by the US justice system for monopolistic practices not at all dissimilar to Rockefeller's. He reinvented himself as a philanthropist. Rockefeller hired the public relations guru of his time, Ivy Lee, and set about polishing up his image. In this famous stunt, he made a great show of going about handing nickels to young children. But Rockefeller was interested in much more than being liked by the common folk. His driving ambition, as it had always been, was power and control, and with Lee's help, he quickly realized he could achieve both ends through one endeavor, the establishment of large charitable foundations. And so the Rockefeller Foundation was born. Through the foundation, J.D. Rockefeller and his son and grandsons were able to rebrand themselves as noble humanitarians, donating millions of dollars to medicine, education, and social causes. Thus, we see the birth of what is now often cynically referred to as Rockefeller medicine. Recognizing the potential to transform medicine from patient-focused care into a consumer good, the family used its sponsorship of medical schools and influence over big magazines like Time and Life to discredit natural remedies and proliferate the leviathan of pharmaceuticals that now define modern medicine, and which, very conveniently for the Rockefellers, are primarily derived from petrochemicals. Meanwhile, understanding that the consolidation of power was contingent on manipulating public opinion and steering the zeitgeist, the 5 third-generation Rockefeller brothers, John, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, were busy extending their influence into social activism. To this end, in 1940, they established the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, whose stated mission to this day is to advance social change that contributes to a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. It is important to note that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is part of the steering group of the Foundation's platform F20, an international network comprising dozens of foundations and philanthropic organizations, notably including George Soros's Open Society Foundations. We shall return to this point. But the Rockefellers' ambition was not confined to the US. It was global in scope. As such, in the aftermath of World War II, they were instrumental in setting up the United Nations, with J.D. Jr. donating money and land for the UN building in New York. His son, Nelson, also became a key player in the political facilitation of this, the first true step toward global government, in his capacity as first Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs under President Truman, and later as Vice President to Gerald Ford. In the 1950s, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund established their Special Studies Project, conceived by its then president Nelson Rockefeller, to define the major problems and opportunities facing the US and clarify national purposes and objectives, and to develop principles which could serve as the basis of future national policy. This bland string of bureaucratic gobbledygook sounds benign, but in fact contained the germ seed for what many now call the New World Order. Jacob Nordengard explains how this group of experts, notably overseen by Henry Kissinger, appeared to view itself as divinely ordained with a historical mission, economic, political, and cultural, to remake the world as they saw fit. Sound familiar? The Special Studies Project ran from 1956 to 1960, and then unfolded throughout the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations, and, with Kissinger's connections, pulled in all the major players in contemporary American hegemonic law, including the CIA, Harvard University, and the Council on Foreign Relations, the foreign policy think tank established in 1921, of which David Rockefeller was director from 1970 to 1985. It is also worth noting that David Rockefeller was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank from 1969 to 1981. The Special Studies Project members quickly understood that to bring about their envisioned utopia, they needed to confront the public with problems that were global in scale and requiring global cooperation, and that science could be used as a tool for international management. Thus, without consulting a single scientist, the project identified two key focus areas: global health, pandemics, and oceanography and meteorology, climate. Thus, once the science was agreed upon, the project then found appropriate scientists, including Roger Revelle, the godfather of anthropogenic global warming, to carry out its research, and through their sprawling NGO apparatus and the Rockefeller University, a private biomedical research organisation, began advancing their agenda, all the while bolstered by grassroots social activism sponsored by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We now move into the 1960s, when the Rockefellers were among the leading funders of the Club of Rome, whose 1972 report, Limits to Growth, paved the way for the modern environmental movement. In 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson became the first US president to publicly speak about global warming, and most viewers by this point should know the rest of the story. Limits to growth sounds antithetical to capitalism, doesn't it? And here one may be asking why ultra-wealthy industrialists, such as the Rockefellers and their many collaborators, would be funding something that ostensibly goes against their own interests. Why indeed? This brings us back to the question posed by my subscriber's husband. Why would they be underwriting the destabilisation of the US and the West, as these economies rely on the supply and purchase of goods on which these people depend for their fortunes? We'll soon come to this, but first we must wrap up our history lecture. We arrive now in the 1970s at the World Economic Forum. Around this time, Henry Kissinger, now Secretary of State to Richard Nixon, became involved in a Rockefeller-sponsored program through Harvard and various other internationalist organs, including the CIA, to shape emerging world leaders. Enter Klaus Schwab. Schwab set up the European Management Forum in 1971, which went on to become the World Economic Forum. In 1972, the UN Conference on Environment declared, in response to the now widely perceived threat of global warming, we have 10 years to stop the catastrophe. Sound familiar? In 1987, the Brundtland Commission, chaired by Maurice Strong, a member of the Club of Rome and Secretary-General of the Stockholm Conference on Environment and a friend of the Rockefellers, and Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Norwegian Prime Minister, set forth the agenda that now defines our current time: to create a plan for the future to manage the planet in a sustainable manner. This then led to the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in 1988, and the UN's Declaration of Climate Change as a global problem, conveniently providing a justification for its own continued existence at the exact moment when the existential threat of the Soviet Union and nuclear war began to wane. Shortly thereafter followed the 1992 Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, which incidentally is my earliest clear memory of the global green agenda, and I recall, as a child at the time, being alarmed at mankind's precipitous trajectory towards self-destruction and frightened of what might happen if we did not take action. Such is the immense power of this type of propaganda on young minds. I did not know at this point that we were already a decade past the UN's supposed point of no return, the first of many, as it turned out. The upshot of the Rio Summit was the infamous Agenda 21, linked in the description, and the anthropogenic climate change narrative was thus embedded in public consciousness, ignoring the multitude of natural factors that contribute to changing atmospheric conditions, and touting the 97% of scientists agree trope, a thoroughly debunked falsehood, linked in the description. We now move into our present paradigm, at the outset of which it was determined by the UN and WEF and their cadre of NGO backers that to tackle the existential threats faced by our species, a global consciousness was required, necessitating a consensus on new global values. Not surprisingly, the man placed at the helm of this nakedly neo-Marxist notion was also a Rockefeller, namely Stephen, son of Nelson, a professor of religion. I kid you not. Stephen helped coordinate the Great Transition Initiative, linked in the description, a flagship program amongst the many that hang off the side of the globalist edifice like barnacles, aimed at creating a global citizens movement. This term, global citizen, is now so ubiquitous that it's used unironically by all and sundry within the progressive camp, and not only by NGOs, but in the marketing campaigns of multinational corporations also. It's an important and extremely powerful piece of globalist newspeak, as its fundamental purpose is to undermine the concept of the nation and instead foster in people, especially the youth, a loyalty not to their own families and local communities, but to the nebulous idea of one world, and whichever class of victim the spin doctors of the machine direct our attention to on any given day, not least the ultimate victim, planet Earth herself. James Lindsay often describes this new religion as a reinvigorated form of pagan Gaia worship. There's not much more to the backstory. You likely know the rest. The WEF's Young Global Leaders program, whose alumni Klaus Schwab boasts have penetrated the cabinets of various national governments. The UN's Agenda 2030, linked in the description, and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The advent of Saint Greta of Thunberg, and the formal partnership of the WEF and the UN in 2019. We now come to 2020, and everybody knows what happens next. For its 75th anniversary, the UN declared a decade of action, and no sooner had the media frenzy over Greta become second-page news than the COVID pandemic was upon us. You'll recall that in the Rockefeller's Special Studies Project of the 1950s, 2 key triggers were agreed upon to facilitate the global consciousness needed to create their one-world utopia under centralised control by an international managerial elite: pandemic and climate change. We've covered the development of the climate narrative, and most of us have been familiar with its widely publicised permutations since we were children. But the pandemic strand was always bubbling along in the background, and this topic necessitates an entirely separate video. But in brief, most of us will recall the staggered dress rehearsals for COVID, SARS in 2002, H5N1 bird flu in 2006, and H1N1 swine flu in 2009. And notably, the WEF Global Risks Report of 2006 stated, "The risk of a pandemic flu, particularly one caused by human-to-human transmission of the H5N1 or another avian flu virus, is now a dominant theme in the global conversation on risk. A lack of information or misinformation leading to a breakdown in public trust in the ability of governments, international institutions or business to manage risk can lead to a spread of fear in ways that greatly amplify the consequences of a particular threat." And few can deny, though many a rubber-faced bureaucrat or beclowned corporate media anchor has tried, the ludicrous serendipity of the WEF's Event 201, linked in the description, in October 2019, which gamed out the forthcoming pandemic and the coordinated global response almost to the letter. The conclusion is simple for anyone who's done a little digging, and my own position on this matter should be obvious, if not already known by viewers who are familiar with my catalogue. COVID was planned well in advance and dramatically staged as the second trigger in the Rockefeller's decades-old two-pronged crisis matrix designed to homogenize global consciousness under a single ruling principle: fear. Mere months into the pandemic, Klaus Schwab announced the Great Reset and was swiftly endorsed by global luminaries, including then Prince Charles and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. Thus, a new social contract was birthed, based not on human rights, but human responsibilities. Citizen of the world, you are responsible. You are responsible for the health of our planet, so you must reduce your carbon footprint. You are responsible for the health of the community, so you must wear a mask, stay home, and get vaccinated, or grandma will die. You are responsible for the poor of the third world, so you must uncomplainingly accept mass immigration. You are responsible for the feelings of others, so you must embrace LGBTQ pride and repeat after us, trans women are women. Indeed, you are responsible for the plight of Palestine, so you must march and protest in solidarity. And all this had been brought about, as I discussed long ago in my video, The Mistake Everyone Makes About Wokeness, linked in the description, not by genuine grassroots upheaval, but by astroturfed activism through the conglomerate of NGOs that spawned around the original philanthropic conmen, the Rockefellers. Foundations such as Open Society, Bill and Melinda Gates, Pritzker, and the rest. In tandem with big business marketing and reinforced through a media and education system massively endowed by these same organizations, here finally J.D. Rockefeller's vision nears its fulfillment. An atomized society of global citizens, godless, nationless, and beholden only to the great centralized scepter of existential dread. And so, I answer my Substack readers' question. Why would they be underwriting the destabilisation of the US and the West as these economies rely on the supply and purchase of goods on which these people depend for their fortunes? I answer, one must understand who these people are, what motivates them, and what they believe. Firstly, it is a schoolboy blunder at this point to equate the economies of the US and the West with the fortunes of the power elite. Western economies produce very little these days other than financial services and war. The plant was outsourced to China and other developing nations decades ago. This is the entire economic premise of globalism. One economy, unbeholden to any national will or spiritual morality. Secondly, these people are not actually business owners and industrialists. Not anymore. Their fortunes do not depend on the supply and purchase of goods. Not anymore. It is amusing when folks earnestly compare the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in the context of the richest man in the world. The amassed wealth of dynasties like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds and the network of aligned interests that their legacies control make Musk's fortune look like a welfare check. These people do not rely on any form of economic exchange for their great wealth. Their wealth is so entrenched and diversified that it's virtually indestructible. As Mayer Amschel Rothschild, founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." Or, as Andrew Tate more succinctly put it when questioned on this very issue, they'll just print the new money. This leads to the question of what motivates them. It is not money. They already have all the money. And if they face a situation where the nature of the money supply does become a problem for them, they'll just reinvent it. This is in fact already in the works with central bank digital currencies. In the meantime, they have so much money that they've run out of things to do with it, other than use it to amass more power. This is precisely what J.D. Rockefeller did once he had more money than he could spend. Channel it into philanthropic organisations for the purpose of socially engineering the common folk in the manner he desired. And this then answers the question of what these people believe. Quite simply, that they have been divinely ordained to rule. They may indeed believe that what they are doing is noble, but this is neither here nor there. They see themselves as gods, and us as their subjects, the great unwashed, cattle, unworthy and incapable of self-determination, and thus it is incumbent on them, the better men, to direct the course of our future, for the greater good, as it were. This is not conjecture. The documented machinations of this elite for the past century prove this mindset, a cult-like religious zealotry, grounded in a narcissistic worship of their own splendid majesty. And here then is the final answer. When dealing with autocrats and psychopaths who zealously believe in what they're doing, why even ask why? We only need to observe what they do. By their fruits shall ye know them. And when we do take stock of their fruits, what do we observe? A tactical matrix of programs and narratives solely aimed at smashing the bonds which have nurtured healthy societies for millennia: family and nationhood, integrity and morality. We can point to any of the progressive hegemonic narratives of our age and chart each one toward the very same inevitable outcomes: the destruction of individual integrity, the destruction of the family unit, the destruction of the middle class, and the destruction of the nation state. Feminism, rainbow pride, transgenderism, ESG, DEI, race politics, sustainability, global health mandates. It all leads to the same place. A divided, atomized society of fearful individuals, weak, malleable and compliant, united only in an anxious and guilt-ridden group consciousness. In conclusion to what may be my longest video to date, it remains only to thank you for watching this far, and to note that the fervent adoption of the Free Palestine cause by the young progressives of the West is yet just another permutation of the same thing, a seed of division sown by the same NGOs and propaganda instruments we have here discussed, with the same end goal: divide and conquer, the destabilisation of our societies and our nations, and the creation of global citizens. And the misdirection is working. Instead of harnessing their youthful zeal and marching on Parliament to hold our criminal leaders accountable for the fact that most of these kids will never be able to afford their own home, or that most of them were poisoned by government-coerced experimental gene therapies 2 years ago, what are they doing? Occupying college campuses and chanting cringy slogans about a conflict 14,000 kilometres away, affecting people they'll never know. And I warned about this at the outset in my video, Don't Get Distracted by the Israel-Palestine thing, linked in the description. Indeed, these rowdy protesters, these young global citizens, have reached my very doorstep. I observed them outside my work a couple of months ago, chanting and shrieking and waving their suspiciously professional-looking placards. I recall noting at the time how scripted the main speaker sounded, the predictable, earnest, mousy teenage girl, as she shrilled into her microphone. How strikingly familiar the talking points sounded, right down to her pleading inflections and robotic cadence. It wasn't until a few weeks later I realised why. My 18-year-old son is in a punk rock band, and he posted a video online from one of his latest gigs, in which a different teenage girl, but equally mousy and earnest, stood on the stage, which was backdropped by a huge Palestinian flag, reciting the very same speech. And in that moment, I realised it was simply the stock standard script of 1,000 TikTok clips, Instagram reels, and YouTube shorts. They're all saying virtually the exact same words. This is because the words were not written by the people speaking them, or even by their friends or members of the wider local movement. They were written by a PR consultant in some sterile NGO office, oceans away in San Francisco, Seattle, or New York. Probably the same office where the professionally printed placards were designed. This is Rockefeller's astroturf activism in action, and it deeply distresses me that my own child is now being sucked in by it. That he and his bleary-eyed pot-smoking buddies, in the strident belief that they are fighting the system, are in fact unwittingly playing straight into the trap laid for them by the system a full century ago. Punk rock my ass. To make matters worse, he's now also posting sustainability propaganda from New Zealand's Green Party. When I saw this, I messaged him saying, "Dude, you're sharing this on a device that's powered by mined rare earth minerals." Bear in mind, this is a good kid, a remarkably intelligent, funny and generous kid. Furthermore, I wasn't completely derelict as a father, and schooled him from an early age in the great fallacy of wokeness. Moreover, this is a boy who used to enjoy watching Paul Joseph Watson videos. But all of that began to change when he hit his teens. I've tried to steer him back on course, but the usual reaction is sullen silence or a grudging acknowledgement that he is willing to consider ideas other than his own. His own ideas? I can't remember having ever been so frustrated with another human. How I yearn to rant and chastise him, to shake him by the collar and make him understand that he evidently has no ideas of his own, as what he is saying comes straight from the operational manual of the World Economic Forum. But what's the point? This is what the kids are into, and the last thing he'll do at 18 is adopt any opinions likely to alienate his clique, especially the girls. My best bet at this point is to hope he grows out of it, like I did. But I wonder. The global consciousness of wokeness was barely dreamt of when I was his age, and the propaganda dissemination devices that each teen now clutches in their palm were still 10 years away. The mind virus is now very advanced, and most rampant in the brains of the young. My son posted another video to his Instagram recently, a wobbly late-night clip shot by a friend or a fan of him performing a cover of the Ramones' Rockaway Beach. I had to resist the urge to comment, "You should have changed the lyrics to Rockefeller Beach." Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Please also subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please do follow me on X at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.